So right now I want to talk about this thing called the Great Awakening, and this comes after our Enlightenment discussion. By reading about the life of Jonathan Edwards, which you're doing right now, you should already know something about the Great Awakening. I had you read the biography of Edwards, and so that we could understand how the Enlightenment affected two extraordinary intellectuals and prominent Americans, along with Franklin, because he shows up in that book as well. So think of the Enlightenment as an intellectual revolution. It changed into how people perceived ideas, authority, politics, and the physical world and religion, among other things. The Great Awakening was another kind of revolution that occurred in the middle of the 18th century. I mean, just as the Enlightenment had a profound impact that led to the American Revolution, I also want to argue that the Great Awakening created conditions that led to the American Revolution. So if I had a chalkboard, I would say Enlightenment, Great Awakening, they both are arrows that lead to the American Revolution. I want to make a comment about something peculiar about what should occur to us about what's going on in this world. So if the Enlightenment is a hyper-rational world in which things are explicitly about reason and evidence and there's a rejection of the supernatural and weird things that don't make any sense anymore. It's only science, okay? And that's definitely going on in the 1700s, okay? At the same time, though, in the middle of the 1700s, we have this massive revival of a kind of a supernatural religion. It seems to me that if the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are really true, and they are, and the real phenomenon, and they really, really are, you should see a death of religion, or a religion that's greatly reduced, or a religion just turns into ethics or morality, but nothing supernatural. I'm going to get to this later on, all right? But the Great Awakening it's at the same time. It's going at the same time. And the Great Awakening is this explosion, this revival of not just religion, but passionate, emotional, supernatural religion. How do they both exist at the same time? Well, you could just say they're completely different populations. You got people way out in Kentucky, making that up, by the way, having crazy emotional experiences as really, really religious. And you got people in New York and Boston who are just having this really rational kind of, anti-Christian but hyper-intellectual experience. Okay, that might be the case sometimes, but we're actually, in many ways, the biggest proponents of the Great Awakening are people like Jonathan Edwards, okay, who are actually hyper-intellectual, hyper-enlightenment, but also hyper-emotional and hyper-religious, really believe in supernatural stuff in many ways. And sometimes there are people who are hyper-intellectual who reject religion. Ben Franklin would be one case, right? Ben Franklin, in a sense, got so enlightened, he read himself out of religion. He thought himself out of religion. People like Thomas Jefferson, same story. You can say it's like their intellectual life took them away from religion. That's a case, right? And there are certainly people who are having this revival and Great Awakening who are very unintellectual. Okay, that's definitely the case, right? So you could say that there's a correlation between how smart you are and how unreligious you are, and how unintelligent you are, and how uneducated, how unenlightened you are, and how unreligious you are. Okay, there's definitely a category of that, and yet a lot of these people, like Jonathan Edwards, are people who are actually both. You would say, in fact, it's the Great Awakening. They're having this religious awakening, not in spite of their enlightenment, intellectual life, but actually because of it. They work in harmony with one another. Okay, so again, we'll talk more about the Great Awakening, but that's something I want you to think about, that weird tension, and I'd like to talk more about how that actually works together. How could that work together? Okay. Why study the Great Awakening at all? Well, because America has been a profoundly Christian nation through most of its history, and the Great Awakening is what turned America into a Christian nation. It's not so much anymore, but for a long history, America was identified as a Christian kind of nation. And actually, America really got really Christian, or the flavor of American Christianity that we call distinctively American Christianity, happened during the Great Awakening. Which is to say, you can't understand American history without understanding the Great Awakening at all. You have to understand Christianity itself to understand American history, and vice versa. Trying to understand American history without a decent understanding of Christianity and the kind of Christianity that was produced by the Great Awakening would be trying to imagine like a tartan, like a plaid fabric, and it's like red, yellow, green, and blue, and you're pulling the red thread out, but leaving the rest there. You can. It would all fall apart. It's woven together, and it gives its integrity. Okay, so what are some of the things that took us to this Great Awakening? Okay, the French and Indian War is something that lasted from 1754 to 1763. We're actually going to get to this later on, right? But during this French and Indian War, American pastors preached sermons that rallied the people. The war was necessary and important, they argued, because Protestant America was battling Catholic France and Canada. This was a holy war, or a term that we use these days is jihad. This was God's war. And so you have Protestant pastors all over America saying, you have got to fight these evil French Catholics. You're fighting for God. Because those French Catholics were on the side of Satan, and thus you were on the side of God. Now, during the American Revolution, the enemy was no longer evil Catholic France, but Great Britain. Then pastors preached against Great Britain. This war was a sacred cause. They called Britain the anti-Christian tyranny. So Christianity is embedded in patterns of thought, even when the thinkers are not Christian. Ben Franklin, I just spoke about Ben Franklin a second ago. He was a deist, meaning, and we spoke about deism during our Enlightenment classes, right? I mean, to be a deist is to be anti-Christian. You're religious, but you're anti-Christian. You still believe in God. You're not an atheist. You're anti-Christian. But even his attempts to build libraries and prove the morals of Americans were rooted in his Christianity. So it's like he had the shadow or the habits of Christianity without actually being Christian. I mean, he gave up his faith, but he kept the moral structure that gave him his faith. I mean, Ben Franklin, again, rejects his Christian faith, but even he would admit that he would not want to be in a world without Christianity. It's like, I'm not a Christian, but I certainly hope most of Americans are Christians, actually believe in this stuff, because it kind of makes America work. We can't have a world without this stuff. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was no friend of Christianity. Again, he was a deist par excellence. He's a guy that tried to find the Gospels, read the Bible. I mean, he literally took a razor blade and cut out all the miraculous parts and just kept the morality of Jesus Christ in his Bibles. But he still believed that the Bible held the society together, even though he didn't believe in most of it, because he just wanted all the morality taken out. So most Americans who are deists still think they kept their deism often to themselves. They wanted all the stuff that Christianity gave to the world, which is to say, Americans are still thinking in Christian framework. They have Christian habits of thought. We don't get to this, but just to point out, there were these things called the 19th century reform movements. In the 19th century, there was something called progressivism. These were attempts to improve the living conditions of people living in urban squalor. They were basically proto-social workers. Not all, but some of these people were not Christian. A lot of them I would call post-Christians. Interestingly enough, a lot of the progressive people who were like proto-social workers, they were often sons and daughters of pastors, or sons and daughters of just hardcore, serious Christians. Post-Christians are like people like John Dewey. John Dewey had more or less given up his faith. But he was dedicated through sociology, through academic work, to improve the conditions of life in society. And many of his ideas were grounded in a Christian ethic. You have to love the weakest and most powerless people amongst you. And the roots are, again, Christian missionary attempts to evangelize the sort of immigrants and the poor in the early 19th century. One thing that happened, again, I'm going way beyond the chronology of this class, but there was a shift in the late 19th century, and they invented this idea, or started talking about this idea called structural sin. During the early 1800s, until the 1800s, people primarily thought of sin as a personal sin. Like your own life is disordered. You are being rebellious against God. You have sinful appetites, and so you're sinning against God, and you are choosing to be a bad person, right? So you have to repent, and by the grace of God, you choose to be a good person. What's going on with these sociologists, though, in the later 19th century is they shift from personal sin to, say, structural sin. So what do we mean by structural sin? Well, for example, you're a man and you're an immigrant and you're living in the inner city of Chicago, or you're living in New York, and you lost your job and you can't provide your family. So you take to drink, you take to drink whiskey and hard liquor. And then you lose your job and you end up beating your wife and kids and just being a derelict. And so, or how's this? You're a young woman and you're living in New York City in the late 1800s, and you're a prostitute, And so the early Christian, early 1800 version of trying to help these people would go something like this, repent, read the Bible, repent, go to church, give this all this stuff, and your problem is you're sinful, you're not repenting. If you repent and give your life to Jesus, then you'll start drinking so much, you'll stop beating up your wife and kids, and you'll be a good father and husband. And you if you give your life to Jesus, young woman, you'll quit being a prostitute, which is horrible. Okay. That would be personal sin. You're choosing to be sinful. What's going on in the late 19th century, though, is a shift of saying, well, look, the reason why that poor girl is a prostitute is not that she has perverse, disgusting appetites. Rather, she's poor. She's been abandoned by her terrible family. She's got nowhere to go. She's got nothing to do. So she goes to prostitution as a sheer kind of desperation. It's not her fault that she's a prostitute. She doesn't want to be a prostitute. No one wants to be a prostitute. All right? But society has driven her there. And that's why there are so many prostitutes. Meaning if you took that one girl and raised her in the countryside, she wouldn't have been a prostitute. But take a little country sweet girl and just plop her off in the middle of New York City and live in squalor and poverty, she'll be a prostitute. Meaning the sin is not in the person, but it's in the structure. The same as a guy who becomes a derelict alcoholic because he has no job. He's humiliated. He's drinking to escape his miserable state. So even though they're not Christian anymore, in the sense that people like John Dewey, the social workers, and these are Americans, I'm suggesting if there's something weirdly Christian, deeply Christian in their anti-Christianity, they talk about structural sin. They still believe in evil. Where does evil come from? These are the categories that come from Christianity that have been deeply modified. This is all to say, even the deists are kind of Christian, even though they're not. Even the post-Christian sociologists like John Dewey, they're kind of Christian, even though they're not.